Today, we will reflect and with aspiration and visionary and women's leadership in South Africa, examine its challenges, the triumphs, and transformative promise. In today's dynamic global landscape shaped by climate change, technological disruption, and evolving governance structures, leaders must embrace strategic foresight and long-term planning. This seminar aims to equip the participants with innovative tools and visionary strategies to lead with confidence and impact. Ladies and gentlemen, you can expect engaging discussions and the opportunity to connect with like-minded professionals dedicated to sustainable leadership. With that, I'm going to give over to the Acting Executive Dean of the TM School, Professor Edith Bashwana, to share some opening and welcome remarks. Prof, thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Our program director, Dr. Valerie Lowe. On behalf of the Vice Chancellor, Professor Buleleng Kabula, the Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair, Professor Pulen Sekgalo, and the representative of the College of Graduate Studies, Professor Jessica Murray, let me take this opportunity to acknowledge the presence of our leadership and the chair of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, the Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University, the chair of Tiger Brand and former Minister of Public Service and Administration in South Africa, Dr. Geraldine Fraser Moleketi. Let me also acknowledge members of the Diplomatic Corps present here and online, Mrs. Dabo Santo, Embassy of the Republic of Guinea, the First Counselor in charge of Economic Affairs, Mrs. Faye Manel Genevieve, Ambassador of Senegal, Mrs. Lazovskia Yulia, the Russian Embassy, Second Secretary present here, Mrs. Milimono Piret Sagese, Embassy of the Republic of Guinea, First Secretary in charge of Socio-Cultural Affairs, Mrs. Sabina Maria, the Embassy of Russian Federation in the Republic of South Africa, Third Secretary, and Ambassador Obodozi, a retired ambassador and a friend of the TM School. Our panelist, Mr. Elias Monache. Let me also acknowledge Professor Jessica More again as a panelist, and Mrs. Mata Bomonze and Professor Darlene Miller from the TM School, as well as the TM School staff and executive committee, all invited guests, our students, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I guess it's important, it takes long to make the protocol, but I hope other speakers will not go again. Yes, will not repeat what I have done. They can just stand on the existing protocol that I have observed. I think if there is anyone that I have inadvertently omitted your name, this was not intentional. You are welcome. The TM School forms part of a list of colleges at UNISA who would like to contribute to the production of knowledge and training of thought leaders in one of our catalytic niche areas called feminism, womanism, Bosadi theorization. The Bosadi theorization is conceptualized to focus on intersectionality and to advocate for feminism as the highest form of humanity. Most women in South Africa, majority of the women in this country and all over the continent, face multiple oppressions because of their race, their class, their sexual orientation, their religion, their ability, their culture, nationality has become also very important lately. Their appearance, and so on and so forth. The lines are many. The lines of oppressions are many. You can count them. So in the preamble to the conceptualization of this catalytic niche area, it is often stated that the most disrespected person in society is the Black woman. The most unprotected person is the Black woman. And that is why feminism, particularly Western feminism, was not enough to deal with some of the challenges that women faces in this continent. That's why intersectionality becomes very important. And we are also delighted to join the College of Human Sciences, the Institute of Gender Studies, the College of Education, the Graduate School of Business Leadership, who have actually taken the lead also in this conceptualization of Bosadi humanism theorization. In the in the School of Business Leadership, they are offering short learning programs on women in leadership. In the College of Education, they are renowned for engaged scholarship in a niche area that they have established and publications on widowhood, covering the plight of widows in the country. And the College of Human Sciences, where the Institute for Gender Studies is based, also conducts interdisciplinary research into eliminating gender-based violence, homophobia, transphobia, discrimination against women in the workplace and in the political arena. So we are also adding to that, and our principal investigator is Professor Darlene Miller, and she's working with some of these colleges in this area. So in the light of the new national dialogue that has been proposed and the renewed calls for a new social compact in South Africa, revisiting the project of citizenship in the light of the many challenges facing our country becomes urgent once again. Given the feminist and womanist critiques of patriarchy and its role in African state failures, it is pertinent to question whether leadership by women or matriarchal leadership offers a better alternative to citizens. Women's Day offers us this opportunity for a renewed interrogation of how and whether women's leadership can be a visionary leadership. I think we need to sit down and reflect on this and try to find out whether women offers an alternative to the leadership crisis that we face all over the continent. These questions need to be addressed not as obscure matters of leadership or leadership tick boxes, but in the context of the practical problems that often bear down most heavily on women across the intersectional board. Women often hold society together as male-dominated states implode, and the bread and butter questions are on the table for urgent consideration. We are thus not focusing on women's issues on this Women's Day, but on the political economy within which our citizenship unfolds. Women are folding under the burden of local statehood, having to manage the dysfunctionalities produced by a government that is battling to hold the center together. Things fall apart, and we are the ones that are expected to stitch the wounds, the pain, and the broken local economies together. Are we able to provide the visionary leadership that society needs? Does this entail upstaging the visionary leadership role of men? Do we have principles of matriarchal leadership that complement, that challenge, and antagonize male leadership within new possibilities? At this seminar discussion, therefore, we want to take stock of the political economy of our society and what this means for citizens, whether women could do things better, lead our economies in a better way, understand with greater depth the socio-economic challenges that face us, consider the socio-economic alternatives. Circular economy, social and solidarity economy, the B20 food policies that various communities and stakeholders are considering nationally and globally in order that we may hold on to visions of an African Renaissance and the hope that must be the fuel for engaged African citizenship. Can women do this? We often list our many strengths and our fortitude and resilience as African women, but we engage at the local and household levels and step back from wider societal leadership. While many women have taken up the challenge of national leadership, or have they succumbed to the structures of patriarchy, femocracy? Or can we contribute to a Renaissance movement that places better alternatives on the table? And I think this seminar today will help us to answer some of these questions as we try to build knowledge around these catalytic niche areas. And we, as the Thabo Mbeki School and UNISA, we want to be known for contributing this very important knowledge in our country around women leadership and visionary leadership. With these words, I would like to say thank you very much. You are welcome to UNISA, welcome to Thabo Mbeki School, welcome to the University of the Land, and have fruitful discussions. I'm looking forward to good discussions. If you don't see me towards the end of the program, I would have stepped out. There are other engagements that the university is busy with, like the UN at 80, so I will dash out to go to that event. But I'm looking forward to fruitful discussions. And I just want to again acknowledge Sekgalo and Professor Sekgalo, Professor Murray for giving. Thank you very much, Valerie. You bring nice energy to this event. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege it actually took me a week to try to summarize the bio of former, yes, of former Minister Fraser Moleketi. And before I start, I just want to apologize to her for the misspelling of her name. There should be an S, and it's not Fraser, it's Fraser Moleketi. Thank you. Dr. Geraldine Jocelyn Fraser Moleketi is the Chancellor of the Nelson Mandela University. She was the former Special Envoy on Gender at the African Development Bank. In this role, she led a strategy to mainstream gender in the bank's policies and operations, making the banks a reference institution on gender equality. Oh, just a little bit. Sure. Okay. She doesn't. Actually, Dr. Geraldine Fraser Moleketi needs no introduction.
Good morning, everybody. Doctor, it's an exciting room to be in. And if you were going to go into this long intro that I saw on your screen, you'd have taken some of my time. I'd want to say good morning to everyone. I stand on all the acknowledgements that have come from Professor Paswana, and that is in no disrespect to anyone. And the reason I make the point of no disrespect is because one of our seasoned diplomats once said that South Africans are lazy, and hence they use this term, all protocol observed. I want to assure you it's not laziness, and that's why I use the words acknowledgements by Prof. Paswana. I'd also want to add another point, and that's the fact that I'm not going to quite stick to the title that was given for my intervention, because I want to go a bit broader than that. So I'm not only going to look at South Africa itself, but I want to go back into a bit of history. But let me start somewhere. This so that I don't get things wrong. So I'm expected to contribute to the State of the Citizen project in South Africa. But I think all of us in this room will contribute to the discussion on the Citizen project in South Africa. So let me start with the point that 2025 marks the 30th anniversary of the 4th World Conference on Women, and actually resulted in what was a groundbreaking Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action. And the reason that I want to make this link in this year of the national dialogue, in this year when we're confronting numerous challenges, and when the question of leadership is correctly placed on our agenda, and I want to thank UNISA and the academics here for placing this on the agenda, because it's quite fundamental. We should take into account and recognize and acknowledge that at that 4th World Conference, the Secretary General was Ambassador Gertrude Mongela from Tanzania. She concluded that conference with the words, and I'm paraphrasing, but the last part is correct, where she says, and I quote, "The revolution has begun," close quotes. So yes, indeed, it could be argued with 50,000 women gathering in Beijing and Huairou in China from different parts of the globe, from different walks of life. That was quite a feat. I mean, I don't think there's been any UN Women's Summit that had brought together so many women from different corners of the globe. And what we also don't acknowledge very much is that Beijing is not the easiest place to get to, depending on where you're coming from on the globe. But women got there, and there were more than 4,000 events taking place simultaneously. There was the Intergovernmental Conference in Beijing, and there was the non-governmental and civil society conference in Huairou. And South Africa had quite a formidable delegation, not because I was part of it, but it was a formidable delegation, country delegation, that was at the Intergovernmental Conference. And I'm using the word country delegation because it wasn't a government delegation. It brought together women from government, civil society, the trade union movements, and that delegation was a multi-party delegation. The private sector was there probably through women who may have double-hatted in some ways at that point. And on the other side, at the NGO conference, there were women just representing all sectors of society, and both delegations included all 9 provinces. The relevance of this is that in this year, as we're engaging with the whole idea of a national dialogue in South Africa, maybe there's some lessons that could be drawn from the Beijing preparatory process. Women-led, women-driven, but we had the full support politically. Because when the NGO group left for Beijing, President Nelson Mandela went to see them off at the airport. And I think it's issues we forget. And these are important moments because the head of state seeing off that delegation was significant. In total, we were 100 strong. And we went there having been through a year-long preparatory process. And in that process, we debated each one of the resolutions that formed the Beijing Platform of Action. During that year, we went to Cabinet with the recommendations that had come organically from women all over the country. And one could share anecdotes around the challenges and the debates, as well as the difficulties of bringing together the voices of women in a way where there were even discussions in taxis by men, and not least shebeens or even smokkelhuise, as they would call it in Western Cape, parts of the Eastern Cape. And it was typically in a way reflecting the uncertainty by men about what Beijing may represent. And they would say to women, hey, don't hold it, don't think you're in Beijing. You know, so those of you who are old enough may remember that, and those who were young enough may have heard that, you know, but that's what it was about. But I thought that I put that on the table here as we deal with the whole issue of the state of the citizen project, to just confirm that as a country, the citizen project must be one that's owned and led by the citizens and done in a way with everyone's involvement. And nobody must say, we don't have resources for it, so we can't do it. Because if I take you further backwards to 1956, 20,000 women marched on Pretoria. And we may forget that that is a significant number of women in this country. And it drew on women across the demographic spectrum. And there were a number of babies either on the backs or on the hips of some of those women. And some of them were dissuaded by their husbands from joining. And very clearly they said, and they used better words, but I'll say they probably said, not a damn, I'm going. And it was more because they wanted to make a point at the time that we have our futures in our hands. And at the end of the day, it's not just about us. It's about the future generations. So as we involved in this intergenerational project, we must never forget there are those who came before us. And those who came before us were as radical, and in instances more radical than we think we are at this point in time. And I think we must never lose that connection. We have a lot to learn from those who come before us. And those of us who are now hitting the mid-60s plus have a lot to share and to learn from the next generation. Because remember, there's also something called upward mentorship. And we don't close ourselves off to that. But I'm sort of going off my script a bit, getting carried away by this critical moment and this energy that we should never lose. And remember, nobody takes away your energy. You allow that to be dissipated. So be careful what you invest into and where, you know? So as I lay the agenda of Beijing and the platform on the table, and I do so noting that we are in a very complex geopolitical environment. And if we thought the gender agenda in its totality was a challenge before, we ain't seen nothing yet. Because we can look across the big pond, across the Atlantic, and we see the clawing back unashamedly. We can look in different spaces, and we look at wars, conflicts, challenges, and we say, would the world be different with women leadership? I think it begs the question, are we women always easy to be co-opted? And I throw that out. Because if you look at the South African Parliament, 40% plus are women. And nobody can say patriarchy has been so overbearing that it's made us adopt certain approaches. It's because we're ready to be co-opted. We are ready to be co-opted, and we should see how we deal with it. And as we deal with these challenges, and I'm going to touch on democracy very briefly, as we deal with these challenges, we must also know we make decisions. And remember, it's not always what you say publicly, but it's what happens in the closed cabinet rooms. Because at the end of the day, the smart one is not the one who leaks. I said, he said, she said. That is actually a sign of absolute weakness. It's being able to fight that battles in there, go out there and reflect a cohesive, united leadership, but knowing where the battleground is and what the issues are, and being able to draw on a larger support network out there. But we don't do it, and then we find excuses. And as I've said, and I say it here today because I've not hidden this, anyone who's in leadership and say, but I can't because, must just resign. Because why are you in leadership if you can't? Because what about the woman in Dachakral? If you are in a position and she's not, and you'll say, but I can't because I have these challenges, resign. Do the right thing, as must the males. Because at the end of the day, we want equal feminist male and female leadership. We don't want to restrict it to one gender. We want the responsibility and obligation to be on everyone. So we have seen the resurgence of right-wing and far-right ideology. We've seen tensions concerning national security and increasing conservatism. And this has had an immediate adverse impact on the global South. As reproductive rights and on reproductive rights. And we must remember 1994 also had the population conference in Cairo, a watershed conference. And today conservatives are still trying to claw back on that. And we must be careful of the Trojan horse being brought into South Africa at this moment, where you have right-wing religious groupings coming from elsewhere, wanting to influence the national discourse. They tried it when we passed the termination of pregnancy legislation. And they tried to doorstop some of us at Parliament at the time. And we said to them, take your argument where you come from, not here. We are us, and we will do what's required. So let me, in my next 12 minutes, I think I have, raise the following issues. It's less than 12. Sure. Okay, so I was going to talk about women's empowerment leadership in South Africa in more detail. I was going to deal with women and the economy and the statistics around that and the challenges there. And then there is the issue of visionary leadership, but let me jump that a little bit and talk about the issue of femocracy. But I think you guys will come and deal with those issues, so I don't need to go there. But let me take you back in history. So let me stop on a nice note. So women on the African continent have long been leaders. And not just leaders of their households, communities, and nations. It's much beyond that. And I want to call out a few. There was the 7th century Berber queen, Dia, who lived in what's now Algeria. She built and commanded a powerful army and fought back against conquest. And she mobilized the scattered Berber tribes into an organized resistance. And as a result, she earned the name Kaina, or seer in Arabic. I had seen our historian, Professor Ndlovu, earlier, so I'm sure he'll be able to add color to a lot of that. We can also talk about Queen... let me go on. We can talk about Queen Njinga of Angola and her role. And it's there, it has been recorded. And we can come to South Africa, and there's many. But the point here is that women's active participation and support were instrumental during Africa's national liberation movements and anti-colonial struggles. And while the way women engaged in the movements may have differed from country to country, all liberation movements involved women. So as I conclude, I want to say one thing. So I was also a member of the military wing of the African National Congress, Umkhonto weSizwe. And I trained both in Angola, I trained in the former Soviet Union, and did some specialized training in other places. But I do want to say one thing. At no point were women placed in the kitchen. And the camp I was in, the first camp in Angola, in Gashitu, there were a battalion of men and women. We were 4 women. And at no point was there abuse. At no point, because there was a clear code. So it goes back to my point. We need to look at how we operate in the different sectors that we find ourselves, because the way in which we operate and the impact we make is where a difference is made for our future. Thank you.
I don't know if I can even... Thank you so much, Dr. Fraser Moleketi. I'm going to decide for you, Ntate Monare, that I will introduce your bio. Ladies and gentlemen, Ntate Ilyas Monare is a seasoned business leader and entrepreneur currently serving as the executive chairperson of Arabella Holdings and Africa Holdings, with diversified interests spanning engineering, procurement, mechatronics, and protective structures. He is also the president of the Black Business Council, the apex body representing Black business in South Africa. With over 30 years of executive leadership experience in the metals and engineering industries, Ntate Monaga has built a reputation for driving strategic growth, industrial transformation, and inclusive economic participation. Beyond his corporate leadership, Monaga plays a pivotal role in shaping national economic and industrial policy. He represents South Africa business on the BRICS Business Council, chairing the South Africa and Russia chapter. On the BRICS Business Council, his portfolios include energy and infrastructure. Monaga holds qualifications in insolvency law and practice, executive coaching from the University of California, Berkeley, and telecommunications regulations from the Wits University. He's the president of Black Business Council, and also he is president of SAISA and BRICS, and he's the co-chair of Turkey and South Africa Business, of Turkey, and also in Saudi Arabia, South Africa Business Council. You see now why Dr. Fraser did not want me to read it. Around, ladies and gentlemen, Ntate Monaga.
Thanks, Doc. Perhaps let me start by standing on the protocol as raised earlier, not because we cannot remember those names and titles of individuals, but it is appropriate to stand on a protocol. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Dumelang. Distinguished guest, fellow panelists, fellow champions of transformation, it is an honor for me as a man to be invited today on this special Women's Day celebration as we reflect on visionary leadership and women's leadership and the state of the citizen project in South Africa. 30 years into democracy, our nation finds itself at a pivotal crossroads where we have forged a resilient political economy, yet persistent inequality and social fractures remind us that the work is far from over. We operate in a challenging environment marked by global headwinds, persistent inequality, and infrastructural constraints. But as the state of the Citizen Project reminds us, our greatest asset is our people. Visionary leadership means recognizing and harnessing our country's diversity and the unique insights that women brings to the forefront, especially as we navigate economic headways. It means committing to ethical governance, transparent institution, and economic transformation that places the citizen not vested interest at the center. The International Monetary Fund projects GDP growth at 1.5% this year, an uptick from 0.8 in 2024. Yet, this modest recovery is shadowed by a national debt burden of 5.7 trillion, equivalent to 76.9% of GDP, underscoring our current urgent need for fiscal prudence and structural reforms. In the first quarter of 2025, formal non-agricultural employment slipped by 74,000 jobs, a 0.7 decline, exposing the fragility of our labor markets and the disproportionate impact of women seeking to support their families. Meanwhile, consumer inflation held at 3.0 in June 2025, and food prices climbing to a 15-month high of 5.1%, signaling that household budgets, especially in townships and rural areas, remain under severe pressure. South African BRICS Business Council represent 40% of women in leadership globally, in comparison to our peers in other BRICS nations. However, that representation of 40% cannot be translated into wealth, inclusiveness of women in the mainstream economy globally, and meaningful transformation at the hardcore of South African economic situation. While the BRICS population constitute more than 42% of the world population and surpass the G7 GDP, women in leadership are non-existent, and that need then to be cautioned and addressed. Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement or area must at least reflect the continental aspiration of Agenda 2063 on economic transformation, inclusive economy, and the role of women in economic emancipation, given the population of the continent of 1.2 billion people, in which predominantly majority will be women, but they're not reflected in terms of any meaningful wealth created by them, let alone in leadership position, both in government and business. Charity begins at home here in South Africa and the continent. While we forge ahead globally, we need to reflect on key sectors. Let me then turn to the state of our key sectors. And I'm not going to mention all of them, but I'm saying key strategic sectors. One, industry and manufacturing. Once the engine of job creation, manufacturing now must reinvent itself through automation, green technologies, and circular economy models. The sector faces constraints and structural challenges marked by lower growth and pressure from global competition, but there are opportunities in advanced manufacturing and green economy segments to drive innovation and women's participation. We must ensure that women entrepreneurs are at the table driving innovation in clean steel, agro-processing, and sustainable textile. Two, finance and business services. Our financial sector is a beacon of stability. Critically, the rising number of women in executive position and in boardrooms is shaping more responsive and responsible financial institutions, yet only 28% of board seats and 24% of executive roles are held by women. But again, that cannot be translated in the wealth of women in the financial services. Visionary leadership reminds or demands from us that we accelerate gender parity in corporate governance and expand microfinancing channels for Black women-owned small, medium enterprises. Financial sector remains robust, serving as a launching pad for both local and continental investments. Three, agriculture and food security. Women produce an estimate of 60% of subsistence crops in rural communities, yet they face systematic barrier in land reform and market access. Equitable extension services, affordable mechanization, and digitalized supply chains are non-negotiable if we are to secure food sovereignty. For mining and energy, as we transition to renewables, women are stepping forward as engineers, community trust leaders, and entrepreneurs in solar and wind projects. We must amplify their voices in energy policy forums and ensure that community benefits reach the household led by widows and single mothers. Technology, which is 5, technology and innovation, digital transformation will define our competitiveness over the past 2 years. Fintech startups funded by women have grown by 28%, yet less than 10% of venture capital flows to them. A deliberate shift in investment criteria can unlock a generational leap in citizen empowerment. Let me then turn to the statistics to summarize the above-mentioned sectoral realities as women participation. In industry and manufacturing, the manufacturing output has stagnated. Women hold just 32% of senior roles in private firms, 32% of senior roles, despite the fact that they are the majority in the country. Yet female-owned enterprises in agro-processing and green textiles have grown 18% year on year, led by women-driven cooperative in the Western Cape. Without targeted procurement and skill programs, women remain excluded from the fourth industrial revolution. Finance and business services, women only occupy 28% of both seats and 24% of executive roles in banking and insurance. The Women Empowerment Fund dispersed 3 billion rand in 2024 to over 400 Black women entrepreneurs, yet just 34% of entrepreneurs are women, trading global peers. Initiatives like ABSA, She Leads, cohort have triple female fintech funders, but ventures capital allocates less than 10% of funds to them. Again, that's the point that I'm raising in terms of the standing, the limitation and the constraints that women faces in the financial services. Agriculture and food security, women produce 60% of subsistence crop, but receive just 12% of commercial land titles. In Limpopo, cooperative exports macadamias to Europe, doubling income in 3 years. Nationally, female smallholders earning average 40% less than male, a gap that will persist unless we enforce gender responsive land reform and extensive extensions of services. Mining, women counts only for 20% of mining sector employees and 50% of energy engineers against the tide. A female-led solar installation firm in the Eastern Cape now powers 12 communities. We must mandate gender quotas in mining licenses and incentivize women-owned renewable ventures. Because if we don't have targets as part of their condition for licenses, it basically means we're not going to change the patterns of ownership and entry in specific sectors. Technology, as mentioned above, the fintech startup funded by women grew 28% over 2 years, yet less than 10% of venture capital goes to them. Again, it's a minute number. To bridge the digital divide, we need subsidized coding academics in townships and rural hubs. Now, let me then deal with special issues that in most cases we don't talk about. They are unbankable communities and rural in various categories. Firstly, let's look at the Stockfells phenomenon, because predominantly it's dominated by women. And again, over 552,000 Stockfells unite more than 11.6 million members with 49.5 billion in pool savings. That represents 60% of members are women. And again, that cannot then be translated in terms of the ownership of the means of production. That cannot be translated into changing the patterns of ownership in various sectors. The second part is the grocery Stockfell, that are 72% are female. Burial groups nearly is 50-50. And these grassroots rotating service and credit associations empower women to manage household budgets, fund education, and build emergency reserves. Our failure to formalize and leverage Stockfells against capital and deprived women of low-cost credit investments, opportunity, and financial literacy. So this is a critical area if one then to change the patterns of credibility and for women to participate in the financial services. And we have failed black women as a society in terms of, one, despite legislative frameworks, black women labor force participation lagged by 15 percentage points behind men. Two, rural female-headed households rely on grants at 58%, down from 63.3% in 2014, but still twice urban rates. Youth unemployment among black women remains about 50%, fueling immigration and social dislocation. We have underinvested in childcare, transport, and digital access, barriers that still confines mothers to the informal sector. Global beacons of women's leadership, if we then look at the island top World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap with 48% female parliamentarians and pay equity laws enforced by fines. Rwanda, again, leads with 61% women in parliament and women-run coffee cooperatives that double export revenues. In New Zealand, material health care reforms under Prime Minister Jacinda cut child poverty by 20%. These examples show that gender quotas, robust data collection and enforcement yield rapid progress. Now, collective mapping from inclusion to transformation. One is gender-responsive procurement. We need then to look at the 40% set aside as part of the regulatory or legislative primary act on procurement. Because if, again, the set aside get an expression in our legislation in terms of the regulation, it will then continue to empower females in procurement so that we're then changing the tides of ownership and the mainstream. Again, the Stockfeld partnership with banks that will provide low-cost loans, financial education, and range of other issues, including childcare, infrastructure, skills, digital access, land reforms, data, accountability. Now, let me then close by two areas. I mean, in 1994, this must be a sober reflection. In 1994, we pledged that never again to the intersecting injustices of race, gender, and geography. Yet today, black women, our rock and backbone, still bear the deepest burdens. Black women still face a labor force participation really 15% points below the national average. We draw inspiration from our four mothers, Watinta Bafazi, Watinta Umbogoto. You strike a woman, you strike a rock. Now, my closing or my parting shots, Doc, is that while South Africa has made substantial progress in empowering women, we must not rest. Far more than we've done to include women in the economy and critical decision-making roles across all the sectors. Today, women are still underrepresented in executive positions. I thank you.
Please give Ntate Manage another round of applause just for being Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege to introduce our discussant very shortly. Professor Jessica Murray is a full professor at the University of South Africa here, where she has been in the Department of English Studies since 2011. She's currently on secondment to the College of Graduate Studies in the School of Transdisciplinary Research and Graduate Studies. In her new role, she's amongst other duties tasked with facilitating the leadership role at the CGS in playing in the optimization of the catalytic niche areas. She is trained as a feminist and queer theorist and published extensively on women's contemporary fiction and historical life writing. I'll just end there. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Valerie. Thank you, Dr. Fraser Moleketi and Mr. Monachi, for such rich and thought-provoking contributions. Listening to you both, I was struck by how your remarks speak to two essential strands of the State of the Citizen project: the moral and political will to act, and the economic and structural capacity to make change real. Dr. Fraser Moleketi, your reflections took us back to the groundbreaking Beijing conference and reminded us that citizenship, especially for women, is an intergenerational project, one that draws on the courage of radical women before us, on the value of upward mentorship, and on the shared responsibility of women and men alike. Your challenge that if you are in leadership and you say you can't, you should resign, reminds us that visionary leadership demands both resolve and accountability, especially in a time when right-wing currents threaten hard-won gains. Mr. Monachi, you've reminded us that South Africa's greatest asset is its people, and that the resilience of our political economy is not enough while inequality remains entrenched. Your emphasis on transparency, structural reform, and the catalytic role of women entrepreneurs in driving innovation speaks to the economic backbone of an active, empowered citizenry. When we bring these perspectives together, we can see that the State of the Citizen project is about far more than legal rights. It's about agency, dignity, and participation in shaping both governance and the economy. This is where our catalytic niche area of feminist, womanist, and Busadi theorizations can help us reimagine the terrain. These frameworks, grounded in African women's lived experiences, teach us that leadership is as much about relationships, care, and collective well-being as it is about policy and profit. They challenge the notion that progress for women can be symbolic only, reminding us that transformation must reach both the corridors of power and the spaces where everyday life unfolds. We must also recognize that the State of the Citizen is not a neutral space. It is contested, shaped by the push and pull of social movements, political forces, and economic interests. Feminist, womanist, and Busadi approaches encourage us to see that reclaiming and reshaping citizenship will require collective courage, a willingness to resist co-option, and an institutional building of support networks that can sustain leaders and communities in the long struggle for equity. This means valuing not only those who hold formal positions of authority, but also the countless leaders working in grassroots movements, cooperatives, and community networks who model what transformative citizenship looks like in practice. I want to leave us with two connected questions because I really want us to allow as much time as possible for more engagement with our fabulous speakers. How do we ensure that the gains women have fought for in governance, in the economy, in civic life are not clawed back in the current geopolitical climate? How can the leadership values you've both described be embedded in our institutions and our markets so that citizens, especially women, are not just beneficiaries of change, but also its architects? These are not questions for women alone, obviously, nor for leaders alone. They are questions for every citizen who believes in the promise of this democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Murray. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going straight into the question and answer session. I'm going to propose that we take 3 questions and then we will take a response from the panelists. By the show of hands, I will bring the mic to you. Thank you.
The question is to Prof. Elias. Yeah.
Professor Elias is.
Mr. Elias, Mr. Elias. Mr. Elias, my question is around stokvels. How can we mobilize stokvels to become a formal power on the JSE, for instance, because we have all this money that you talked about this morning? How do we get there? That's my question.
Thank you so much for your question. We will take 3 questions and then response.
Thank you very much, colleagues. My comment is also to you, Mr. Monache, around the issue of stokvels. I think many or some of us in this room can attest to the fact that we were raised by women who were part of these stokvels. Some of us are professionals and professors today because of how women managed to come together and to actually build their families and make sure their children are where they are today. And I'm wondering how we can also create a space to be able to acknowledge that and the fact that they were successful in doing so. I am a firm supporter of the idea of financial literacy and women getting space in the formal sector. But I also ask, at what cost? And we also acknowledge the fact that women actually do have financial literacy. If they didn't, they would not have achieved as much as they've done within these informal sectors. I think the importance of starting first from a position of acknowledging the strength that is already there in our communities and the knowledge that women have in coming together and actually building and successful spaces where they support their families is very important. One of the challenges that I have that before we go to the JSE is to also accept the racist nature of our banking systems, that even as we draw and go to our banks and say, how can we work with the banks to make sure that Abu Mama, are brought into these spaces, acknowledging that these formalized spaces have never been for women and that they are racist in nature, as has been shown for a very long time. So how do we deal with that as well as we move towards formalizing? And I think even beyond the banks, just our general systems and structures also need to be, they need a relook. That if we look at Rwanda and other places where there's been successes in terms of formalizing, in terms of exporting, that when we look here at home, we can only do that if we are operating within functioning systems, so that as women come into these spaces that they're able to thrive. But I think as I pause, I think at the core of what I'm saying is that let's acknowledge first how women actually are and continue to be very successful in these informal spaces, and what will we be taking away when we formalize. So we need to have that debate, even as we think about how can we even broaden what they're already doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very inspiring contributions. My question is around the economy, particularly because, as we know, Black and colored women have been marginalized in these very triple jeopardy kind of ways. And so when we look at the formal economy and our ability as business women to grow within the structure of this very patriarchal capitalist society, it creates a kind of disconnection between how some of us see community and the contributions we want to make to communities or in our communities and our workers. But capitalism does not make space for that kind of upward mentorship. The resource is not accounted for in the bottom line. And so can capitalism in its current form really address some of Africa's challenges? Because as Professor Dr. Fraser Muleketi mentioned, to be able to mentor a young woman who is getting into an institution that has been built through the logic of hierarchy and power, she will need extra time that is not accounted for in her billable hours. So how do we think about labor relations? How do we think about workforce? How do we think about the economy and what it does not account for in its capitalist form?
Thank you so much. You, okay.
You know, it's a pity I'm not a professor nor a doctor. The last time when I checked, in 1986, I was expelled in one of the universities in the country after I'd spent 2.5 years. I'm not a dropout, so I was expelled. So I think let's deal with the critical areas that we're faced with. Firstly, as a society, that in 1994, we went to the polls and voted for a particular organization or organizations. And we then attained freedom. And that freedom that we keep saying we are 30 years or 31 years in democracy, it excluded the economic issues. It is a democracy that failed to deal with the patterns of ownership, failed to deal with the structure and the architecture of the economy. And we basically then change the color of the buildings inside and even the occupants inside. But the actual dominance of certain economic powers remained in the hands of minority. And to this day, we still have that problem. I'm paraphrasing that so that we cannot just then look at this thing in a linear way to say, this is a situation, how then do we just go and register at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange? We need then to look at the hard core in terms of the structural problems and the architecture of our economy that it still remains in the hands of white people. They will then have certain laws and regulation that prohibits and bar a broader participation. And I mean, you know, the irony of the whole situation is that in other countries, legislation is passed to cover and secure minority. Is that clear? I'm saying in other countries, the parliamentarians, they will come with legislation and regulation and laws to basically protect minority. In this country, the other way around. Majority that happen to be black, they are in power, but they have nothing to show in the economic spheres of this country. And we try then to pass legislation to change things around, but we are not changing the architecture of this thing. I want to give a number of examples so that you can then understand and see this thing, particularly in the financial services. If today you go to any rural area, you'll see big houses being built, double stories being built, and various other structures that have been built. And those structures are not built because they are funded or loaned by the banks. They are not. Because banks, they took a view a long time ago that one, you don't fund or loan any individual that is going to build a house in rural areas, because that is not a land that you'll then have a title deed. In an event where an individual then default, you cannot then repossess because it's a PTO. Now, I'm raising that point so that in as much as we want to talk about inclusive economy, we need then to see the structure of our economy that need then to change drastically. And this is a capitalist society, by the way. And I'm raising that point so that, again, you need then to understand how financial institutions, they look at the risk from a different point of view. I mean, the forms that they were, if, Prof, those years you wanted to buy a house, the form that you are filling in 30 years, you are still filling the same form today. There's no change. So why am I raising that point? It's so that you need then to see the trend in terms of exclusivity, the way risk have been defined to exclude others in the mainstream economy. Again, if we then look at the cellular companies, so I gave you a scenario on housing or land issues. I want to give you a scenario on cell phones. You know, when cell phones were introduced in this country, we're still on analog. We're still using the normal phones. And majority of the people, by the way, they didn't have landline telephones. Now, in 1994, 95, 96, when Paula Jordan was a Minister of Communication, we then passed a legislation that compelled the operators in their license conditions to deal with what is called universal service, not access. Universal service basically means each and every household, they need them to have a telephone. Access, that means you can travel certain kilometers, whatever, then for you then to access a telephone. But we had a quantum leap as a country because we then moved, most people, they didn't have a landline in their household. But in 2000, majority of people that historically didn't have any access to telephone, all of them, they find themselves with a handset of whether it's 6110, Nokia, Motorola, Ericsson, whatever. The reason why I'm raising that point is because, again, look at the shift from analog to digital. As a country, we had a quantum leap where majority of excluded people, because historically, if you go to Vodacom, MTN, you want a cell phone, they were looking for contract phones. But majority of our people, they didn't qualify, by the way. And that's the reason why there was then a shift to a prepaid. Because these cell phone companies, they're not making money on contracts. They're making money on prepaid, selling airtime, data, and so forth. And remember the handset. A worker will basically then save money, whether it's 10,000 or whatever amount, then to buy a handset so that it can then have an access to communication. To date, if we then look at all communities, regardless whether they stay in a shack or ever, what are we seeing? We're seeing each and every household, they will have a smartphone in whatever form or shape. Now, why am I raising that point? It's so that you need then to see financial exclusions in different sectors forces people to do things differently. And as a result of that, now when we end up seeing things changing, we then think, this organization, they are good to us. They are not. This is a capitalist society. For them, they are driven by profits. Now, my point is then the following. The Stokvels and the taxi industry, one, they are not going close to any bank for a number of reasons. Because if they were then to go to a bank, SARS will basically say, you have this amount of money, can I then get my share? You need then to pay for that amount of money. And I'm saying that is a part of the issues that you are then faced with. Now, what do we need then to do? Remember, we don't own any banking institution in the country. The regulation in the banking from Treasury, finance, and so forth is still tilted towards a particular system and architecture that exclude all of us. And that's the point that I'm raising, that we cannot then say, let us go to the Joburg Stock Exchange. Firstly, we need then to say, how do we deal with financial inclusiveness across the board, where the taxi industry, because they move people, more than 70% of the population in this country, they rely on public transport, use a taxi, not trains, because we don't have trains. Now, before we then talk about that, we need then to look at the regulation. We need then to look at legislation that must then empower the Stokvels to be recognized and acknowledge the role that they play. Most schools in rural areas were not built by government, they were built by the communities, where females, women, they were basically then saving money to build one classroom, and until they end up with a number of classes. I mean, whether you can look at all rural areas in different provinces, that is how the evolution of education in Black communities emanated from. So I'm raising this point so that in the absence of us collectively then changing, as the citizen, changing the patterns of economy, the patterns of ownership, and coming with legislation and acts that give an expression to what we desire. Let me then conclude on the Public Procurement Act. You might recall that historically we had the Preferential Procurement Act. It was then challenged, and part of the challenges was that you cannot then have a primary act that does not set aside certain categories of projects, but the regulation then give a supreme provisions from your primary act. Now, what am I saying? The current Public Procurement Act, we have a set aside for women 40% on all state projects. Anything that government they do, they need then to set aside 40% for women. Now, I'm raising that point because if the legislation then talks to the provision of the Constitution in terms of giving expression to the redress of the imbalance of the past, we need a regulation that must then to do these issues. But again, we don't have any regulation as things stand now. That must then say to ESCOM, the 7 billion rand on your transformers, 40% must be set aside for women. We don't have that. Or we don't have a regulation that says to ESCOM, the 14,000 transmission lines that you want to build at a value of 330 billion rand, 40% must be set aside to women. We don't have that regulation. And there are a number of reasons why either individuals that are dragging their feet. The rail infrastructure that need then to be rebuilt, it will amount to billions again. The 40% must then be set aside for women. And other categories, women-owned entities, youth, people living with disabilities, and various other categories. And I'm saying those are some of the issues that we need then to look at. Now, my parting shot, colleagues, is the following, that we need then to say, what are the key issues that we need? In as much as we're then talking about the national dialogue on the 14th or the 15th this month, and there are other meetings that will then take place even next year. On the economic side, for example, on the document before the various organizations, the economic issues is very, very limited. It does not talk about patterns of ownership. And I'm saying it is all of us, we need then to make our job, our responsibility to write and make submissions on the economic issues to say, what type of economy do we want and we desire as a society? What forms of patterns of ownership that will then allow and empower women in different categories and different sectors? We need them to do that as part of the submission when we talk about the national dialogue, so that on the economic issues, we don't lose anything as a country, as a specific section of the population or the citizen. Equally so, the current discourse in the global arena around tariffs, we need also then to say, where then do we fit as Black people, historically excluded? How then do we navigate and deal with the patterns of ownership and changes and driving wealth and the empowerment of women so that they are not left out in dealing with these issues? The last part for me is it then deals with both in the BRICS configuration, there is what is called BRICS Alliance, Women Alliance. We need then to say what are the key critical areas that women need then to play in the BRICS Women Alliance across the entire global south, so that we don't miss a particular agenda and project on empowerment of women, including the set aside for funding, because the BRICS Bank, they are now looking at funding projects outside government, particularly the private sector, the medium enterprises for women-owned businesses. The last thing we need also then to reconfigure the 2063 agenda in terms of saying, how then do we see the entire continent, Africa? We cannot then have Africa free trade continental area, but we then fold our arms, we are not saying anything. Remember, whatever that we are faced with here on the Stockfell side, in other countries is happening. Every week, every day, people, they are moving money from here to the neighboring countries using a different platform. And we cannot then remain silent and mum on this thing. The pensioners, they are paid every time on a regular basis using big institutions, whether they get their grants from Pick and Pay and various other financial institutions. Where are the women businesses that they need them to be part of this thing? Because when they get their grants at the Pick and Pay store, female businesses in those rural areas, they're then excluded because you don't find any shelf product that comes from local businesses that are owned by women, that are part of the Stockfell. They're excluded in that supply chain. So these are some of the issues that I'm saying we need then to look at an appropriate and proper submission so the structure and the absence of a regulation does not continue and perpetuate the legacy of excluding females. So for me, those are some of the issues that we need to consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions raised, and thanks. I'm going to build on some of what you raised, but I'm also going to challenge you. So I want to just talk about the fact that the two questions that have come up is really about informality and how we deal with informality. Because the reality is that we talk about the duality, not only of the South African economy, but the African economy. And I think many of you would have followed in recent times that there's been a debate that was actually raised by a CEO of one of the banks. We challenged the unemployment figure in South Africa. And he raised that, and I'm not speaking for him, I'm speaking for us in the room, but the issue has come up in the sense that we are aware that there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity. As a matter of fact, the literature has it that Africa has the highest number of entrepreneurs and startups, but also quite a high number of failures in that. So one needs to raise that. So on that, whilst Africa has the highest level of women entrepreneurial activity globally, only 2% of funding raised by African ventures, and that's in 2024, were received by female-led ventures. So I think it's a data point that's there. It's also key to emphasize that the slow progress towards African women economic empowerment is not due to a lack of women's participation. You know, and while female entrepreneurs struggle to access funding, on the other hand, traditional banks, and this was referred to earlier, so your commercial banks sit with the challenge of not having access to what they call bankable women-owned SMEs. So what do we do? We're not going to complain about it. We must say, what do we do to ensure that we create more, or we create a pipeline of bankable products and projects and entrepreneurships? And this challenge I put out to the universities and to the business schools in particular, and the incubation hubs. Go out there, find it, make those projects bankable. Because we need to ensure that as we try to address the issue of financing, we must also take into account the missing middle of women. So, you know, you'll get money for Darlene, when we were in high school, I think we read something called the ragged-trousered philanthropist. So you have philanthropists that give small amount of money. And this is just to keep women selling the tomatoes on the side of the road. And I think what we want to look at is how do we help them graduate from that? But then we also need to look at graduating the women in the missing middle, because you don't really, so you get funds from commercial banks for the big hitters. And for us to claim there are not enough well, let me put it this way. There are not enough, there's not been enough transformation in the economy in a real sense that has changed you know, the whole issue of patterns of ownership of the economy to the extent required. But there are some people who have hit, what would one call it, sort of the high end of the economy, the billionaires, the millionaires and that. They are there. They can get money from commercial banks. But there's the missing middle where women may not have the collateral required. So commercial banks don't really provide the space and opportunity. And as I spoke earlier, we need to look at who is able to graduate from the lower level. So we are seeing emerging funding trends that reflect a surge in partnerships amongst institutions to solve some of the systemic challenges by mobilizing financial resources, by sharing knowledge, building platforms and capability. But the reality is it's not enough, and we need to see. So we're also seeing more commercial banks working with other ecosystem players to lend to women. But again, it's not enough. And as I'm saying, be targeted. Let's see how we can support. What will come out of this meeting, where we say there are 3 things that we're going to do, and we're challenging universities to play a role as well in making it happen. So, banks seek risk sharing partnerships with entities such as the African Guarantee Fund. How many women in this room know about the African Guarantee Fund? So it's also about access to information and available information to make a difference, because the AGF plays a pivotal role in mitigating credit risk associated with lending to SMEs. We must make that information known, and they also favor women entrepreneurs. We also need to see how this is dealt with, and I can go into a lot more. But the one point I want to make, and I want to lift it out of the earlier input, is that while regulators and government agencies have a critical role to play in influencing policy formulation and implementation that affects the effectiveness of SME support programs, we are seeing a rise in efforts by governments to coordinate with multilateral development banks and other co-financiers. Again, do we have that knowledge available? Are the universities sharing that? Are they making it available, or are we anecdotal about what cannot be done? And I think sometimes we sit in that corner too much. We lament what is not, rather than saying, how do we stretch what is there? And here, I'd want to say that public-private partnerships are essential in mobilizing investments in the continent through co-financing platforms. Last point under that is the issue of private equity and venture capital. And I think there's a need, again, and I put out the challenge to both scholars, faculty, students, entrepreneurs, go out there and look at it. Because private equity and venture capital play an important role in the economic development of emerging markets. So even as we involved in the G20 and the W20, and they are looking at the whole issue of women's empowerment, let's ensure that we are in the right spaces, because we want women-owned venture capital to prioritize not only investment in women-owned entrepreneurs, but especially that. And we've seen emergence of partnerships around that. So I'll give you one example. There's a private equity group in South Africa, Nigeria, called Alatia Identity. Alatia Identity was formed, I think, nearly 10 years ago. I was in the African Development Bank, and we said there's no private equity companies that are women-owned and women-led. We need to set up one such. And the African Development Bank put $10 million into it, but said you must fundraise for the rest. And it happened. They closed at more than 100 million euros a year ago. So I'm saying again, it's not about talk, and what can't be done. It's action. And out of today, look at those action items, because otherwise we are going to sit and talk, and we'll come and tell you the same things next year. But we can't look at how have we transformed the informal sector. And we must also bear in mind that we must have an understanding, and this is, I think, a point that was alluded to, that you want to retain a certain level of informality. We won't be able to do away with it immediately, precisely because of the structure of the economy right now. And I want to throw in with that a last point. Look at China. How did China lift so many billions out of poverty since 1995? And we talk about the Chinese only in negative terms. And mind you, the Chinese is charting a socialist path with market characteristics. So let's take into account why was that done. And I think it's a model to look at. Then I want to go to the points that you've raised, and I think I've dealt in part with the second part of it through adding to the comments made. But mine is, let's own our agency. And let's identify what must be done, and let's do it. And let's look at the regulatory environment that is there and see how much must we push it further. As a matter of fact, the Deputy Director General in the Treasury that is looking at financial inclusion, she's a woman. Anga, she spoke at the International Women's Day last year. And she was, no, it was last year. It was last year where she was. So I think in many instances, we don't sufficiently access resources that are there and hold them accountable. So it goes to my earlier point as well. And I know Darlene is sending me a note and saying it's time. So how do we ensure that the gains are not clawed back? We can only ensure that by, amongst others, rebuilding a social movement around this, because we've got to do it, we've got to use our numbers. And we always talk about the fact that there's more women than men, 51% and all that. Why are we not using those numbers? Why aren't we rebuilding the social movements in order to intervene on each of the challenges in the sector? But also bear in mind that not all women are transformative and progressive in thinking, just like not all men are. So we must also remember that this is a contested space, even amongst women. And we need to look at how we deal with it. And there's nothing wrong with spaces being contested. Let's just ready ourselves and tool ourselves with the right arguments to deal with it. Come back to academia. And this is where the Thabo Mbeki School must act and take its place for the role that it should play to assert progressive and transformative thinking. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Fraser, Malakete, as well as Mtate Monache. Again, Professor Pashwana, Professor Murray, Professor, Malay's already here. Just come to the fore, sorry. Oh, and Prof. Sachalo, thank you, sorry.
Oh, we're giving chocolate. Yeah. Women will all house. Wow. Yay. Those who ask questions. Sure. All right. Oh. Everybody gets it.
Okay, we must go, we must move.
Again, but
Yes.
is it fine? Is it fine? And she just went from. You can chew me now. Absolutely.
That we are used to lies. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's your pleasure.
Again. Oh, microphone.
So far, Dr. Muna,
I didn't better.
are you declaring?
Okay.
The chair is declaring.
No, it's not lunch.
Ooh, look at them go all African. Look.
It's from the College of Graduate Studies.
Yes.
Is it a watch?
Courtesy.
Minister on the budget, they used to give Carol Bowles what she had.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Kind.
For your roles.
No, absolutely. I think now it's tea break.
Yeah.
22.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now breaking for tea and we'll meet each other back here at 11 hours 40 minutes. Thank you. Enjoy. Reconnecting with ingenuity for individuals and institutions alike can unlock new potential and achieve positive outcomes. I'm going to introduce our first panelist for this session, Ms. Mabato Montse. She's a personal leadership and entrepreneurship coach based in Tshwane, South Africa. She is a master's graduate of the Wits School of Governance, where in her master's research, she investigated women's social entrepreneurship as a bridge to community-centered development. Mabato is currently pursuing her doctoral studies, focusing on metaphysical, intergenerational memory inheritance, ancestral trauma, decoloniality, and transformative personal growth. Her work is deeply informed by African cosmology, which centers into the vital cosmic force that unites all beings within an interconnected web of life. Drawing from metaphysical principles like Butu, Siriti, Umrao, Mabato advocates for communal care, relational ethics, and intergenerational healing. She integrates these values into a practice as traditional healer and diviner, cultivating ancestral dialogue and ecological harmony to address psycho-spiritual effects of colonization. As a passionate podcast host, writer, and advocate for regenerative leadership and culturally grounded education, Mabato leverages her experience to inspire renewal, resilience, and transformative change. Her initiative amplifies the healing of ancestral ruptures, fostering cultural empowerment, trust, and solidarity to create pathways forward to colonial futures. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mabato.
Thank you so much. It's still morning, so good morning, distinguished guests, fellow speakers, and to all who have gathered here today and online. As our program manager has mentioned, my name is Mabato Montse, and I speak to you today as a woman forged in the fracture between promises made and promises broken, between nation and neglect. I'm the daughter of a migrant mother from Lesotho. My great-grandmother was from Botswana, from the Basarwa community. And I was born in apartheid South Africa and raised under the democratic constitution that promised dignity but delivered dispossession. I speak from a place where ideology meets lived experience and where scholarship is not abstract. My intellectual work is rooted in African metaphysics, ancestral healing, and decolonial political thought, but it is also deeply personal because I have lived what I write, the betrayal of the post-colonial state, the burden of symbolic inclusion, the violence of being named citizen while being structurally discarded. We gather here today under the banner Women's Day, in a country that claims to honor women, while its institutions continue to disfigure us materially, psychically, and spiritually. Our identities have been conscripted into nation-building narratives that glorify strength and resilience, but never address the cost. This speech is not a celebration. It is a confrontation with the limits of post-apartheid citizenship, with the state's ongoing metaphysical violence against African women, and with the language of transformation that masks structural abandonment. My talk is titled Unmothered Nation, Black Womanhood, Political Betrayal, and the Metaphysical Crisis of Citizenship in South Africa. It is an invitation to think beyond legal inclusion and symbolic empowerment, to interrogate what it means to be made legible to a state that does not protect you, to ask, what does it mean to be seen but not safeguarded? Before we can imagine a just future, we must first name the spiritual disorientation at the heart of the national project. And we must tell the truth. The post-apartheid state has not mothered its women. It has managed them, it has mythologized them, and abandoned them in performance. I speak as a daughter of the Imbokodo, the women of 1956 who marched not only against past laws, but against an entire system that sought to erase their presence and to crush their power. When they declared Watinta Bafazi, Watinta Imbokodo, they were not just demanding recognition, they were declaring a metaphysical truth. You cannot strike a woman without striking the ethical foundation of the nation. On 9 August 1956, over 20,000 women delivered a petition to the union buildings. But what they were really delivering was a warning. This country will not stand if its women are crushed beneath it. They marched with babies on their backs and fire in their bones, and they demanded a future in which African women would no longer be governed by fear, nor used as mules for a nation that refuses to account for them. Yet here we are, 70 years later, and the betrayal continues. The question before us, what is the state of the citizen project in South Africa, cannot be answered through legal metrics and sanitized reports. It must be answered through the bodies of women who continue to mother a nation that will not mother them back. We must confront the reality the post-apartheid state has failed African women, not symbolically, structurally, economically, and spiritually. There is no mother in the state. This is not a metaphor, it is a crisis of being. The women who birthed this democracy have been erased from its architecture. Their labor was used to build it, their suffering was used to legitimize it. Their image is now rated as proof of progress. But their lives remain shattered by economic abandonment, spatial violence, and metaphysical disinheritance. The state calls us Black women, in inverted commas, as if this term is an honor. But it is not a recognition, it is regulation. Black women is not an identity we chose. It is a racialized containment strategy invented by white supremacy to manage the aftershocks of its own violence. It was designed to hold contradiction, to make us hyper-visible but voiceless, desirable but disposable, strong but unsupported. White supremacy imagined the Black woman as a figure of endurance, never sovereignty. It constructed the category to absorb labor, pain, and silence. Then it built institutions around that fantasy, economic systems that extract from us, policies that perform inclusion without power, and cultural narratives that celebrate our strength while refusing to share the load. But the greater tragedy is not just how we have been named. It is how, in the face of systemic violence, many have internalized the logic of whiteness, the co-optation, aspiring towards its privileges while losing the grounding of Africanness. We were not always like this. We came from the lineages that honored Siriti, also known as Isdima, a person's spiritual presence cultivated through ethical relation, and Botho, the principle of humanity, dignity, and shared becoming. These are not soft values. They are the foundation of African moral order. Their displacement is not accidental. It is the result of centuries of conquest that taught us to mistrust our own soul. At a systemic level, Black and colored women remain pushed to the margins of the South African society. Poor housing, precarious work, unsafe public spaces, and the daily violence which persists. Policy language speaks of inclusion, but on the ground, little changes. In fact, it worsens. The state's engagement with women often reduces visibility projects, performing empowerment while leaving oppressive structures intact. At a personal level, these pressures are relentless. Women are expected to remain composed regardless of hardship. So when we look at the story of Jocelyn, how do we ask ourselves questions as a nation? Exhaustion is romanticized as strength. Silence is mistaken as dignity. We were speaking about intergenerational healing and knowledge, but do older African women have the capacity to sit down with me as a young divorcee and say, "Age, my child, I decided to stay because I did not have access to employment, to this, to this, to that." I have got access to that, and so I do not have to stay in a toxic environment, right? Because I also bleed, and I feel it. Spiritually, the consequences are severe. Severed from ancestral systems of guidance, land, lineage, and community, many women live in environments normalized for transactional sex. The erosion of communal ethics are no longer peripheral issues. They have become outcomes of a state that has abandoned its responsibility to nurture and protect. In fact, it is them that sponsor BBLs in Turkey and wherever else. This leadership void is not confined to marginalized communities. Many individuals in positions of political power and influence are widely known for their involvement in criminal enterprises. Drug lords, human traffickers, and corrupt officials are not anomalies. They've become normal. They are embedded in the structures of governance. Public office, in many cases, has become a vehicle for personal enrichment other than a site for public service. The absence of ethical leadership is no longer a hidden crisis. It has become a defining characteristic of this state. This is the triple jeopardy we carry, not because of who we are, but because of what this nation has become. To be a woman in South Africa today is to carry the nation on your back and still told you are not enough. To raise children inside a democracy that does not remember your name. To die slowly in a system that calls you beneficiary while treating you as a burden. The patriarchal state has failed. We must stop pretending that this is accidental. It is structural, it is designed, and it is upheld not just by history, but by the present, by those who govern, those who speak in our names, and those who trade our silence for seats at the tables that were never built to feed us. The patriarchal state in its black post-colonial form has failed. It has failed to honor the foundational role of women in liberation. It has failed to transform the economic and social systems that grind our lives into dust. It has failed to recognize that without spiritual repair, no political solution will hold. We do not need to be empowered. We are not broken. The nation is. We do not need to be included in a system that thrives on our exclusion and violation. We need a different system altogether. Colonialism was not merely the theft of land or labor. It was a metaphysical invasion. It fractured African people from the cosmologies that once ordered life. It severed the umbilical cord between the human and the modern human, rupturing Ntu, the vital force that binds spirit, matter, and meaning. Rivers were renamed, rituals outlawed, ancestral sites desecrated. We were not just displaced, we were disorientated. For African women, this violence was triple-edged, ontological, spatial, and spiritual. We were named through empire, but never sovereign, never holy. And even now, when we speak of clarity, we are called angry. When we resist the scripted roles, we are labeled unstable. And when we retreat to tend to our souls, we are deemed weak. But what if instability is the beginning of truth? What if self-exile is not self-abandonment, but the first step towards self-recovery? Refusal to be a part of this system, then, is not just rebellion for its own sake. It is a fidelity to the ancestors, to the land, and to the soul of this continent. We refuse because we have not forgotten, because we know that this nation cannot be mothered by institutions that were never designed to honor the feminine. My turn to ritual, to dreaming, to healing traditions of Ubungoma is not nostalgia. It is a political act. It is metaphysical resistance. In these traditions, the body is not simply flesh, it is archive, it is altar, it is compass. It remembers the codes empire tried to erase. Through invocation, silence, and spirit listening, we begin to repair the fracture. We begin to live beyond curated identities imposed by capitalism and patriarchy. Umsamo is not merely a domestic altar. It is the original seat of governance, the axis where cosmology, ethics, and identity align. It is the space where African womanhood is not performance but principle, not role but radiance. It is where we reconnect with the Great Mother, not as myth, but as melanated power. We are children of the sun Ramasedi and the desecration of Umsamo by both colonial and post-colonial states is nothing less than a metaphysical disconnection from the umbilical cord itself. In isiXhosa, we call it imbeleko, a rite that reconnects the child to ancestors. What then is a nation that severs itself from this cord? The African three-legged pot offers a model of balance, governance, and it teaches that life holds only when three forces are in relation. Men whose power must be protective, not dominant. Women who carry governance, spiritual continuity, and the life force. And the modern human world that carries the ancestors' land and unseen intelligence that animate ethics. Removing one leg means the pot falls. This is the state of South Africa. The post-colonial state has inherited colonial frameworks and mistaken them for progress. It has confused performance with power, inclusion with justice, optics with transformation. It has desecrated Umsamo, eroded Siriti, and treated Botho as a branding exercise rather than a spiritual ethic. The work of a mothered nation, so us, the women in this room, the task before us is not to tweak the system, but to reconstitute the ground upon which it stands. We must reclaim Siriti not as aura or image, but as the spiritual presence that made us recognizable to ourselves and to each other. We must restore Botho not as rhetoric, but as the governing principle that dignifies being in relation. It affirms ethical interdependence and sanctifies care. And we must rebuild from Umsamo not as a private ritual, but as a public strategy, a cosmological foundation from which power can be rerouted, justice re-embodied, and nationhood remothered. It is not soft work, it is not decorative, it is hard labor of truth-telling in a time of spiritual disfigurement. To speak of a mothered nation is not to invoke sentiment. It is to declare that no nation can thrive when the feminine is dishonored, where land is plundered and where soul is silenced. We must spiritualize political life. We must refuse the soullessness of neoliberal abstraction. We must name without fear that the patriarchal project has failed. And in its place, we must call forward the cosmological intelligence of African womanhood, not as victims, not as optic, but as origin and as future. The Great Mother is not behind us, she is within us. And from this place of Umsamo, we rise, not just to remember, but to remake. Ke a leboha.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we give Mabatu another round of applause? When she spoke, I became hot, cold, hot, cold. So I'm not going to add anything. I'm sure when Professor Miller wraps up, she will do some discussant work there. The next speaker is, I'm tempted to say no, don't need any introduction as well. But no, Professor Talien Miller is an associate professor at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. She has her story of scholar activism and ethnographic research in Africa. Her doctorate was on African labor in post-apartheid Southern Africa and South African food retail multinationals like the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in the United States. She was the director of the Institute for African Alternatives, a senior advisor to the president of the International Sciences Research Council in Paris and Cape Town, and the CEO of the Human Sciences Research Council, the Bloomberg Fellow for the African Division of Human Rights Watch in New York, and the National Educator for the South African Commercial, Catering and Allied Workers Union. We have a unionist with us. Her current research focuses on feminism, indigenous matriarchal leadership, Krotua, and food sustainability. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Talien Miller.
So my talk is called Recentering Indigeneity. You heard of our catalytic niche areas. UNISA has generated an integrated research program for the university called the catalytic niche areas. To catalyze means to accelerate or cause an action or process to begin. A niche is a specialist area. So this integrated research plan, consisting of 10 different niche areas, means to accelerate transformation towards a decolonized society, to place research at the service of society. One of our 3 areas of focus for the CNAs here at the Thabo Mbeki African School is the CNA on Womanism, Feminism, and Bosadi. Our research project, that is my co-principal investigator, Dr. Valerie Lowe, We've got, is Lefa still here? Ms. Lefachi Mohachi is one of our members. She's from Politics Department. From UNISA, we have someone from an Indian university and a University of Stellenbosch postgraduate student, and we are still growing. The title of that research project is called Indigenous Matriarchs, Corporate Citizens and Food Partnerships. So the people we had this morning is part of us beginning that engagement with corporate citizens. Tata Mbeki often says that apparently, he says in his conversations that the business community was willing to give some large number of trillions of rands to facilitate the development program. Somehow we didn't take that back. We say, stop focusing so much on the failings of political parties. What are corporate citizens doing in this country? And we want to focus our research on those entities. Hence, we didn't fully introduce Dr. Fraser, but she's also the chairperson of Tiger Brands. And thank you to her for our sweeties on the table. Okay, so, yeah. Okay, on being woman, first, we are not eternal earth mothers. I begin with a quote. Feminine energy is very dark. I don't know where all the love and light came from, but somewhere along the line, someone decided to wrap the divine feminine in pastel ribbons and gentle whispers, trying to make her smaller, softer, sweeter than she ever was. Maybe it was easier to swallow her that way, but maybe it's less threatening if you can paint her in pink and lullabies rather than the obsidian truth of her power. But let's be honest, the divine feminine is not here to soothe your ego or stroke your insecurities. She's here to rip the mask off your carefully constructed illusions and laugh as you try to put it back on. You want to talk about love and light? Darling, the womb is a cavern, not a sunbeam. The ocean is a graveyard before it is ever a playground. Feminine energy is the midnight storm, the black velvet between stars, the wild howl in the forest that chills your bones. So, let the world tremble. Let the stars bear witness. Let every shadow tell our story, for we are the storm, the shadow, the secret, the sacred. We are every woman who ever dares to be whole, dark, divine, and utterly unstoppable. And we are only just beginning. That's from the prose of Steve Delano Garcia, so I'm only just beginning now. So, the second thing I want to go to is sources of toxic femininity. We always talk about toxic masculinity. Let's give a thought to toxic femininity. And let's begin with the thing that bothers many women. How vicious other women can be towards them. Or what I call the PhD syndrome. And no, it's not your doctor of philosophy, it's the pull her down syndrome. So how does misery provide the murky waters that cloud the ethical ecosystem of your body? Let's look at a typology of PHDS, the pull her down syndrome. Quickly, the institutional context on the one axis, the ethical ecosystem, either individual, social, systemic, organizational, and the PHDS index. And I'm saying where you have a harsh, a low, a bad, a murky, an exacting, a too exacting environment, the correlation is a low ethical ecosystem and a high pull-her-down syndrome. Where you have a gentle, accommodating environment, a high ethical ecosystem, you will have a lower PHDS index. That's a thesis. I can't go into that now as in an argument that I'm putting forward, but just to flag that with you. Women, and therefore women's leadership, can cut down, hurt, and do damage. I draw on the insight by Rosa Luxemburg and Leon Trotsky, the early 20th century German and Russian revolutionaries, who said that socialism cannot thrive in the midst of barbarism, that we cannot have processes of capitalist accumulation that serve to wipe out the majority of humankind and hope for a sane and sustainable society. The socialist alternative is built on the organizing principle from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. What are you able to give? What is within your capacity to give on the one hand? And what do you need to ensure a sustainable and good quality of life on the other hand? So 2 beans for Gogo and 7 beans for working woman. According to this maxim, this should be the guiding principle of the gentle society. It is a profoundly collective principle in which a society produces its collective wealth and then redistributes that wealth and its produce according to people's needs. But what Leon Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg are saying is that you cannot build a strong collective identity where the general good is maintained instead of having an overindulged Kim Kardashian 1%. You cannot build a strong collective identity in the midst of want, poverty, and inhumanity. When we live in the midst of genocide as a species, for example, such as the Palestine genocide, we are creating misery and inhumanity. Monache shared with us some of the structural and systemic conditions that produce want and misery in South Africa. Working class people and the poor turn on each other when our livelihoods are being eroded, such as we witness with xenophobia and hatred of our fellow Africans from other parts of Africa. We compete with African sisters for places at the hospitals because there is not enough medical care for all of us. The spirit of the socialist collective of Ubuntu cannot thrive in the midst of want. Women are no different from humans in that sense. When conditions are rough for us, when we are in pain overload, when our bodies are racked with exhaustion and an avalanche of problems, when we have to be the local state in order to make up for the failures of the national state, when we have to figure out how to deal with drug addiction in our homes or the homes of our family members, with violent and aggressive male behavior, with multiple abuses of the bodies of women through masculine violence, gender-based violence, when we don't know where to turn anymore to try and prevent the misery, when we sway under fatigue and hopelessness, we turn on those we may perceive as more vulnerable, women and children. We have recently seen examples of women killing and selling their own children in South Africa. Some horrible, high-profile cases that have been made public in recent months. That too is womanhood. So no, womanhood is not an eternal good. It is not the Mama Africa we pretend that it is. Womanhood can be toxic, and given our suppressed egos and contained aggression within the cage of womanhood, when we unleash those Kali energies, it can be more nuclear than Trump's nuclear ships, more toxic than Hiroshima, because we are able to strike at the heart of those who are most vulnerable, already trodden on, beaten down, oppressed, Bosadi. We can take our hands and rip out hearts. This is the power of toxic femininity. We inflict wounds. But what are the sources of visionary imaginaries and revolutionary potentialities in our womanhood? What ingredients predispose us as women to find the recipes for evolved ethical ecosystems in our bodies? And I turn to an experiment called the Green Leadership Schools. I would like to share with you, those are the references. We'll try to share as much with people who have attended. This work is published in at least 5 different articles with Nomalanga Mkhize, Rebecca Pointer, Babalwa Magotwana, and then we've got Being Octopus with Rebecca and I. So there are articles where you can go and follow up these ideas. The Green Leadership Schools. I'd like to share one example of how a few women academics envisaged an alternative university, which we called the Green Leadership Schools. Decolonization is not just about the exchange of ideas and challenging the hierarchy of ideas, but fundamentally also about our place in nature. Hence, a decolonized education necessarily makes way for the exchange of ideas, but also integrated practices that incorporate a full body experience, that open people up to creativity and awaken tired spirits by reconnecting to the land and environment, a process of re-enchantment. Decolonizing practices, to quote Magudwana 2018, involve care, empathy, life-giving, and collectivism, as well as aesthetic and spiritual encounters. The pedagogy of Africology guided our curriculum and our learning intent. And so we use the octopus. Can we shift? Okay, go back. Okay, so here we have the students and lecturers in Coffee Bay. We wanted to get as close to what felt like nature because we see nature as something separate from us. And we were at Mpande Women's Co-op. So down the road we had our lectures, and then they'd be interspersed with us going into the garden and working these gardens. Next. Being octopus became the symbol of the school, a pedagogy for indigenous ways of knowing and green leadership. This experiment started in 2014, and we had 5 schools after that, exploring indigenous environmental knowledge and creating a space of healing and re-enchantment. The pedagogic approach included the process of healing and rejuvenating the lives of activists, government officials, trade unionists, and university students. Similar to the concept of Deleuze and Guattari's 2004 Becoming Animal and Becoming Wolf, we represented the school as becoming octopus, a creature with green blood becoming green. The highest brain-to-body ratio of any invertebrate is the octopus. Many slithering arms to twist and escape oppression. Some of you might remember that the Domestic Workers Union used to have a symbol of a woman with 8 arms or 6 arms, and she had a broom in the one hand and a mop in the other hand. And we said, thank you, Sadhu, for donating that image of how much a woman carries in society. But we want to be beauty, we want to be life, we want to be re-enchantment. We want to do all of that in a way that uplifts and re-enchants us, not that drags us down. Many slithering arms to twist and escape oppression and slide away, because that's what the octopus does, right? If it's angry or it's threatened, it squirts and then it moves to another space. So escape oppression and slide away from toxic spaces, and 3 hearts for the 3-hearted practices of love, bodily integration, and mind-spirit awareness. I'm going to jump now to matriarchal leadership. It was interesting that in 2015, the last day, the 2 mamas at the school, I put on a blue thing and she put on a blue duk. And then we looked at each other and we said, but now why are you wearing blue? We're at the Green Leadership School. We've been wearing green all week. And then in 2015, we said, actually, it's because the next school is going to be the Blue Leadership School. And when I listened to everybody talking about marine studies and blue economy, I think we were already getting some tips from our ancestors there. Next. Green leaders, women leadership. So to matriarchal leadership. Visionary leadership has to envision what a better life for all would look like. Does matriarchal leadership offer us a space-time that reshapes our ways of being, that allows us to live differently in this world so we may attain beautiful lives? My premise is womanist, and I suspect somewhat more subversive than the domesticated concept of gender. Womanism was advanced by Alice Walker in 1981, when Northern feminism was being critiqued for its failure to deal with race and socio-economic conditions. I'm going to skip to I speak about servant womanhood, and I also say that women submit or imitate, becoming femocratic leaders, as Amina Mama calls it, women who lead like men. And then I'm going to go to what I call indigenous feminisms, adding the indigenous spirit, the connected crone. The crone is an old and wise woman, she in Africa whose knowledge has been eviscerated through epistemic injustice. Understanding the spirit of our ancestry, where we came from, how our peoples were, their variable strengths and weaknesses, their place and sense of place. All of these aspects of indigeneity provide a full and intersectional account of our identity. This is not the indigeneity of tribalistic divisiveness or the dismissal of Western science. It is the enlightened embrace of different civilizational knowledge from across the globe, east to west, north to south, local to global, personal to political, and from the individual body to the planet and abstract theory. Okay, I won't go into the theory there. we will distribute our papers so you can get the fuller exposition of our arguments. And then to try and draw to a close, I speak of pain as the great teacher, the trauma and the betrayals, wounded bodies and evolved ethical ecosystems in our bodies. Is there a woman who can say she has lived without pain? That pain is partially caused by the cycles of life, but also by our most intimate loved ones, husbands, children, girlfriends, siblings. What do we do with those wounds? Do we allow them to turn septic and to become a fount of bitterness? What kind of ethical ecosystem do we create in our bodies? This is not a function of our biological makeup. Pain is the teacher, and oppressed beings know pain. This is where the potential wisdom resides. If we turn away from this wisdom, we become empty gongs, diminished human beings. We join the tribe of the toxic, whether masculine or feminism. So to conclude on recentering indigeneity, indigeneity is a path, I would argue, to ethical being. Man conquers nature personhood, where we plunder, play with ferocity, and ultimately unleash nuclear technologies on our planet and the people within it. This is the dangerous state of toxic masculinity, that space where we are careless with sweet womanhood. We need to rediscover the primacy of the collective over the individual. And the pain of womanhood predisposes us to walk more gently on the earth, to place some curbs on a rampant ego, and to place collective needs at the center of our being. To this extent, women is a higher, more evolved creature than crass masculinity, but it is a potentiality, a potential disposition. If we are predisposed to be better humans, it does not mean we are or become better humans. It is a constant striving to be better humans. My active citizen is the connected crone. It is a society-centered citizenship that departs from masculine, state-centric citizenship. The connected crone defies disposability. I'm 65, but I ain't going anywhere fast. The connected crone defies disposability and stitches threads past, present, and future into golden threads for a society that becomes a safe space, ipanti, for women and LGBTQIA+, and our offspring, our future generations. Thank you. For the indulgence.
Thank you very much to these two speakers for such thought-provoking presentations. I'm going to open the floor for questions. We will take 3 questions at a go and then allow the panelists to respond. Thank you. Which one?
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for your thought-provoking views. Mabatu, I've got a question for you. There's a debate going on about trans men and women. So in a African space, they will articulate it. My question to you is, how do our daughters compete with trans women in this current economy and in their emancipation, especially Black women? Thank you.
Thank you so much. My question also goes to Mabatu. So as you were talking, I was reflecting and I was reminded of a paper I wrote, A Place of God, the relationship between water, mountain, forest as sacramental places of worship, prayer, and baptism, a critical analysis of ritual practice in the church. And I'm just reflecting, how do we therefore reimagine, protect, preserve the identity of women within the church spaces in African indigenous knowledge? So how do we protect women when you're going to Ukutwasa and your gobela solicitate sex from you, when you're going to charismatic Christian churches and they tell you in order to get deliverance, this is what you need to do? And also, initiation is it's a rigorous testing time if you have been initiated. So I just wanted to understand, how can we critically engage Western psychological tools like psychometric test, assessment, and diagnosis, labels such as schizophrenia or mental disorder, when they actually misinterpret or pathologize African spiritual experiences, such as having an ancestral calling or dreams, or when you go to Twasa. So how can we decolonize mental disorder and psychology and reaffirm and affirm indigenous spirituality or African indigenous knowledge system in the Western psychology? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. Is there anyone else with a question? Or a comment or a contribution?
Thank you so much. My question is to Prof. Miller. So when Prof. Paswana was speaking, one of the first things she mentioned was that the Black woman is the most disrespected and unprotected because things fall apart and she's expected to come back and then pick up the pieces. And Mabato mentioned something, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, mentioned something along those lines where she says we are celebrated for our strength while they're refusing to help us carry the load. Now, when Prof. Miller was speaking, you mentioned that there isn't really a woman, I'm paraphrasing now, that can say that she's lived without pain. And then you continue and you say that pain is the teacher and the oppressed know this well. Now, my question is, in our quest to reconnect with indigeneity, is it not then, is it not then our role, or rather our responsibility, to find a way to change that mindset that we as the current women should not have to be taught through pain, because we've already gone through that, we've already been oppressed, we've already learned all those lessons. Is there no better way for us to learn without having to endure the pain? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You may respond, Mabatu.
Thank you so much. Those are very thoughtful questions, and they're very interconnected because they speak to the psyche of people generally, of humanity, right? When I speak about psyche, I'm talking about your orientation, so how you view the world and what you think is possible in the world. And I'll say this to answer the first question, right? Issue of gender and sexuality. In African cosmology, we have
for example, you look at Kemet, right? What the Greeks did when they, or the Romans, when they conquered Africa, they removed the context of how and why we believe in ancestors and we believe in different energies. African cosmology is not necessarily gendered in a sense that you are a man and you only have male energy principle in you. African spirituality is that I, as a body, have got the feminine and the masculine principles or energies in me. And for me to be a healthy human being, these two must be balanced. And in my own research, the masculine is very much connected to a particular way of thinking, which is very mental, which is very meta-driven, and you will see it with patriarchy. Patriarchy is very materialistic. It's very dominant, sort of like in its approach, right? Whereas the feminine principle or energy is more heart-centered. So when you equalize or harmonize the relationship between your mind, meaning your thoughts, and your heart, your ability to feel for other people, which is Boto, right? Then you are able to be a healthier person because you are not triggered by trauma. So what they have created with oppression is that because Black people or oppressed people of the world, BIPOC people, have been pushed into a scarcity mindset, our brains, our thought patterns are very survivalist. They are very high on the animalist. How do I kill that one to get what I want? That is unsophisticated thinking, and that is patriarchal thinking in its capitalistic form. It does not think, how do I share the whole in a way that makes sure that everybody has God. And so when you talk about the sports space, for example, and gender, in African cosmology, we were not necessarily raised according to our sex, because sex has been used by patriarchy to oppress the feminine energy, right? And so when you begin to think about how a particular energy manifests itself in the body, then you do not think about it in a very linear way. I'm a man, you're a woman, and that's that. So it begins to shift, because even chemically, our chemical composition has a lot to do with how we are. And it speaks to individuality, diversity within a collective. I hope it gives you a sort of like an answer. And then with regards to spirituality, you take an example of Christianity as a belief system. It removed all the women who had very significant roles to play in their mythology, because Christianity is based on a mythology, right? Just like all other religions are based on a particular story. And so it decentered the role of women in divinity. And so that is why you will see in the Catholic Church, it is the Pope who is a male, who is acceptable. Even within African churches, it becomes the man, and then this man becomes oppressive because he believes he is at the top. And when he is at the top, he is more powerful than the others, and therefore has got the right to do whatever they wish, to others. My spirituality is that there is no one above another one. My experiences can help you understand your experiences better. They do not inform your own life. That is why in my literature, it is important for each and every one of us to connect with the inner self. Now, that inner self, it has been wounded because our structures as Africans have been removed. And so even your idea of what love is as a woman is very princess-like, which is not what African womanhood represents in terms of what love is or femininity. So our entire psyche has been confused. And so the point from which we interpret reality and our experiences is flawed a lot of the time. I hope it helps to... Thank you.
So the question is, if pain is the great teacher, are we inviting pain in? What is our relationship with pain? And I want to cite 3 kinds of pain. The one is life cycle pain. People die. That's painful, but it's an inevitable part of your life cycle. There are things that will happen in the life cycle that you don't have control over, and that will bring you pain. The second kind of pain is the pain we select, and I think some of that is by conforming. For example, we go into spaces of patriarchal power and we participate in the patriarchal system in ways that can hurt us too. So much of gender-based violence happens in the home. The research shows that globally. And so much of abuse and violence against women happens from someone that you know. So does that mean we don't go into those relationships? That is your personal choice, how you navigate that patriarchal system, the extent to which you participate. But you have to be mindful of how you are protecting yourself and how your body recovers and what are your healing practices that restore your body when you are subjected to pain. When we on the 4IRAI treadmill, and we want to be ahead and we want to innovate and we have all these linear examples of development, it often places us in a space where we are completely neglectful of the ecosystem and the health of the body. So how do you protect yourself when you select pain within the patriarchal system? The third one is an interesting one, and I'm going to call her Rebel Girl, because Rebel Girl does not conform. And I'm going to put the Slay Queen in the category of the Rebel Girl, believe it or not. And the reason I put Slay Queen there is because she's decided, that's it, I've had enough of the pain. Pay up, buddy. Be my blesser. You see these eyelashes? They cost money. Pay up there. So it's a particular kind of what I see as a young feminism. But I think that they are negotiating a very, very tricky space because you're entering into transactional relationships. But you're entering there as a rebel in some ways. You're not being the good wife. You're not exactly the good wife when you go into the Slay Queen space. There's a lot of personal enjoyment, personal enrichment that you will get out of that space. But you have to be very careful as to the extent to which you are playing with the boundaries of patriarchal oppression. And those kinds of identities, this new kind of feminism, can kick back and can actually hit back against you. Does that mean Rebel Girl must conform? Well, then she wouldn't be a rebel girl, would she? So a last important point is that we are not here to suppress the pink feminine. Gender and sexuality is a continuum. With my daughter, she could wear Barbie today and she could wear shorts tomorrow. What do you choose in which cycle of life? You don't have to be wedded to any one single sexuality for the entire life. Pink is a beautiful color. Pink is something that we can claim back. We don't need to be dictated to in terms of the aesthetics that we choose. So no, we're not like the old feminists who say everybody must walk with like a Mao Zedong shirt in gray and everybody must look the same. No, be creative, be playful. That is what actually invigorates and reinvigorates your imagination and allows you to negate the pain that is an inevitable part of this journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Miller and Mabato. There is another hand at the back. It's like I'm paying people to ask a question. Which one do you prefer?
As a man, I deserve two. Thank you for the beautiful presentation. I'm Dr. Emmanuel Rollins from the Abad Litulis Sachishe. So I just want to go back to the topic, the broad topic for this seminar, visionary leadership and women's leadership. And I want to just bring up two questions from that topic. One will be feminist vision. I'm wondering, I'm interested to know if there's any anything like feminist vision of leadership. And I wonder what it will look like. This connects me to the next question, which is in terms of power, exercise of power, enacting power, using power as a woman. I'm wondering if there's going to be a kind of difference of how feminists will enact power. Or will it just be a replication of how patriarchy style of power is exercised? So is there anything unique about feminist women power exhibition or manifestation or exercising of power? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other contributions, either in the form of a question or a comment, before I hand the mic to the panelists? Thank you. You can respond, the both of you. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think I tried to demonstrate the power of an African woman in what I shared. If it was unclear, I'd be happy to share my speech. However, in my response to my sister who asked about spirituality and oppression of people who go to initiation or to the church, the first form of power for me is spiritual power. Right? And if my response to her question was that I, as a woman, as an African woman who has got spiritual power, my process is that anyone who comes to me for spiritual advice or learning or mentorship, I would not say to them, I am your answer. I would say to them, these are my experiences. What are you going through? These are questions that you must ask yourself and you must honestly answer to discover your real fears and your real desires. That for me, spiritual power is the first power, and that is why in my talk I spoke about umsamo. At umsamo, ugogo had 9 children and 18 grandchildren, but ugogo knew how to relate ethically with all these different characters.
So when we talk about power and we talk about African indigenous knowledge systems, we know that African women have been very instrumental in raising large families that required them to share power in interesting ways. But again, you look at a place like Ghana, for example, you look at the market, it's Black women who are in the market. And you look at a place like South Africa, when women are next to the streets selling whatever they are selling, and then the Metro Police comes and it takes their things. And we don't see how structural power is oppressive. We were speaking about informal and formal economies. What then do we say must happen to those people who are selling next to the street? So the ways in which I understand power, Doctor, is very different to how the current structure that the current powers, whether it's in the US or in South Africa, are fighting so hard to hold on to, and yet they see. I think they see that they have failed because you look at inequality is growing. The levels of crime, violent crime is becoming worse. Every week you see how there is a cash in transit heist. And, it's okay. But then, again, when we speak about power, we've been observing a very public discussion. I think he's a judge, right, who has had sexual relations with a junior worker. I don't watch the news, but I've seen this in social media. And the way Ntatole answers, he answers like a man who does not have a wife and children and who does not hold public office. And so the ways in which men understand power is very problematic, because at least a woman in that situation might have a bit of shame. But there's no shame. So, I could go on and expand on some of my thoughts, but I'm very critical of the state in its current state, and the fact that in our national dialogue, we do not speak about why the state is the way it is, why we have a Black leadership for over 30 years, and yet the lives of Black people continue to become nothing. Why is it that we have a complete department of economics, entrepreneurship, and all these things, and yet a tuck shop cannot function in Mamelodi, and it must be owned by a person from Pakistan? Why is it that in Moletlane, where my grandfather is from, in Zebediela, when I say to my cousin who's unemployed, and I say, let's do a tuck shop, and they say to me, Sesi, batlore bang humisha. Why is it a problem for a Black person to see another Black person prosper? These are things we don't question ourselves, because the very people who are leading us have internalized Black oppression, and their proximity to whiteness has made them to not feel for Black people because they want to be like white people. And so, Doctor, my answer is that I am refusing to be like a white person. And in my refusal, I'm also saying in Rukagogo, in me, the umsamo in me is what demonstrates my ethical and matriarchal leadership. Through my years as an entrepreneur, I think I have contributed to over 200 meals of young Black people in Mamelodi. I have mentored over 20 young Black artists because I understand that creativity for us as Black people comes naturally, but we don't necessarily have got the business acumen because you need to be part of the structure, right? My being here is because she sees herself as an older woman with experience giving me space. So this is what matriarchal leadership looks like. Thank you.
What Mabato said. Can we go and eat now after our vote of thanks? Yes, I don't see Tsepo here, so can you just do it? I'll pull it up for you quickly. We're just finding Valerie's vote of thanks. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Okay. Add the marketing and communications. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to do the vote of thanks on behalf of the team. It is my honor to deliver the vote of thanks on behalf of the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, the Chief Albert Lutuli Research Chair, and the College of Graduate Studies here at UNISA. As we conclude on this insightful and enriching Women's Day event, my first vote of thanks goes to Professor Edith Bashwana and the Acting Executive Dean of the TM School for her warm welcome. Prof, in your absence, your opening remarks were thought-provoking. Thank you for setting the tone for this event. I would also like to thank Dr. Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, the chairperson of the TM Foundation. Your valuable insights have significantly contributed to the success of this event and have provided us with much to reflect upon. Thank you for sharing your political and academic experience that is linked to active citizenry. Ntate Elias Monage, thank you for coming. Your advanced presentation was informative and engaging, offering us new perspectives and ideas in the world of business and entrepreneurship. Professor Jessica Murray, receive our heartfelt gratitude for sharing your expertise and knowledge. Your extensive experience on women's contemporary fiction is valuable. I would like to thank you for steering up the discussion and made this event a success. I would like to appreciate Ms. Mabato Montse for your social entrepreneurial skills and your advocacy for regenerative leadership and culturally grounded education, which are all linked to the current debate unfolding at the institutions of higher learning. Keep up the good work. To our champion, Matriarchal lineage, colored identity, and women's leadership, Prof. Talian Miller, your presentation speaks volumes about the strength and the spirit of womanhood. Thank you for advancing the cause of making South Africa a better place for women to live. Thank you. In conclusion, I would like to thank myself. Yes. I would like to thank myself for leading us, as well as I'm thanking the marketing team of the TM School and the organizing committee and you, our guests. Please give yourselves a round of applause. And all participants for your invaluable contributions and participation at this year's Women's Celebrations. I thank you all. Have a fabulous afternoon.
The lunch will be served at 1 o'clock else.
Lunch will be served at 1. Thank you.